Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you into this morning's webinar where we're going to spend some time looking at adding parts and labor, or really starting to build estimates and repair orders inside of our writer. So at the top of the screen, I've got my icon up here for new EST. So before I can start adding parts and or labor onto a repair order, I've got to go ahead and start myself a new estimate. So we're going to search, as we often do, by customer's last name. I'm going to start a brand new customer in this case. In this case, Tony Pierce stopped by to see us. Again, for those of you that are using Gen 1, you'll notice this window looks a little bit different, but all the boxes are exactly the same. As we've reworked a lot of the windows, we've laid them out in a more user-friendly or logical format. So here's my customer information, address. He's at 1234 Main Street. And then over here where it's the phone, we've got 6 different phone numbers. We'll put a phone number in for our friend Tony. In the lower right-hand corner, go ahead and click on OK. Similar statement about the vehicle window. Again, what we've done is we've laid these down in a little bit more logical format. If you're using what we call our quick VIN functionality, and I wanted to put in a license plate for our friend and then click on VIN lookup, it'll tell me that that license plate registered to a 2006 Ford Taurus. When I click on yes, it's going to resolve year, make, model, and engine. One subtle difference, or one difference, Gen 1 versus Gen 2, is the presence of this icon over here on the right-hand side where it says ACES. ACES is a vehicle resolution standard that is used by a lot of different catalog providers, meaning it's a whole list of year, make, model, engine, submodel, body style, everything that goes underneath that there. A lot of our catalog integrations are using or supporting the ACES standard. So new to Gen 2 is our ACES standard. In Gen 1, if you're using the Epicor integration, then that's what it's done, is it's gone ahead and resolved year, make, model, and then engine, in my case, against my Epicor standard. If you're not using Epicor, then when it came back from Carfax and told me it's a 2006 Ford Taurus with a 3-liter engine, it would populate that information in the year, make, model as well. So that's not dependent on the Epicor integration. But again, not our purpose here today to spend a lot of time covering this. Again, we did a webinar a couple weeks back that went in depth into both the customer and the vehicle windows. Really more looking at is, as we get into the estimate itself, we've got our service request tab is where I, by default, am going to start. So as we talk about adding parts and labor onto an estimate, our conversation starts here on this service requests window. Now this does look a little bit different, Gen 1 versus Gen 2, but the base functionality still the same. What I mean by that is, with Gen 2, over on the left-hand side, you'll notice under services, we've got checkboxes that I can go ahead and add if I wanted to add jobs onto this transaction. So I check next to brake evaluation. I also check next to engine diagnoses. What you'll notice is I've got an up and down or a scroll bar here with Gen 2. And what you'll find is that the difference here, Gen 1 versus Gen 2, so Gen 1 in the service request tab, you can configure 6 different, we'll call them quick jobs, things that we can quickly add onto a transaction when we're looking to bring in or handle the customer intake process. Most commonly used for those diagnostic items that we're adding frequently to customers' transactions when they walk through the door. So be it a courtesy check or a brake evaluation or an engine diagnostic service. And the request was to expand that to allow us to have more than 6. So that's your functionality in Gen 2. Again, you'll notice that I have more than 6 configured in my list. You'll also notice down at the very bottom where it says trans flush, that box is already pre-selected. Now, not really applicable. I should probably change my configuration. But what you can do with Gen 2 is you can tell the system that you can have jobs that are required. You'll notice when I attempted to turn that off, it says, well, this is a required element. And so it's adding it on automatically. Again, most commonly that'll be used for things like a courtesy inspection, where each time a customer comes in, we're going to do that for every vehicle by default. So we want that added. But as we talk about adding parts and labor onto a transaction, the first place we stop is looking at these buttons here. And again, whether it's Gen 1 and I've got the check boxes, I've got my 6 different elements laid out towards the bottom, or whether it's using the up and down scroll with Gen 2, once I hit post labor, what that does is that adds those items onto our transaction. Now it added on an engine diagnostic check, a brake evaluation, as well as a trans flush as we went through. A little bit of a different look and feel to them based upon whether or not they're adding parts as well. In order to start out fresh, we're going to go back and we're going to take these off of this just so that we can say, well, exactly what is it doing there, and or how would we do that if we were just adding parts and labor along with our transaction. So we've got our ticket for our friend Tony Pierce. If we're not using the service requests tab, then we get into our parts and labor tab. And when we're here, again, there's a number of different ways to get elements added onto a transaction. Again, we're using our catalog integrations, our repair or diagnostic guides, whether we're utilizing former and or declined services that were performed. But our purpose today is to really focus on two icons. These up here at the top where it says labor, and then second to the right where it says part. Using those icons to add labor lines and or part items onto a transaction. So let's start by building a basic oil change. I went to my labor icon. Inside of my labor icon, I have a predefined list of categories and operations. So if I drop this window down, so we're going to do a basic oil change. So if I scroll down through my list, I'll find a category that I've created that's called oil changes. And when we get into this afternoon's webinar, we're going to talk about, well, how do we configure some of these things? So again, a little more about how that list gets defined in a future or a level 2 webinar this afternoon. Underneath my category of oil changes, I've got, in my case, about 25 or 30 different oil changes. I've got not only my standard weights, but semi-synthetics, high mileage, full synthetics, so a fairly extensive category of services. For our purposes, we're going to add one of our standard weights of oil, just that 5W30 full service oil change. When I go to add that onto my transaction, to the lower right-hand corner where it says pricing, probably the most relevant piece to take a deeper look at as we're going through. I'm giving my technicians 0.2 of an hour flat rate time, pardon me, for having performed that oil change. Now that doesn't necessarily mean that's what I'm paying them. Depending on my pay plan, I may or may not be using that. However, in my case, I'm using the flat rate time to also keep track of proficiency and efficiency. So 0.2 of an hour is what I've got pre-configured to be added whenever we do an oil change. My hourly labor rate is $85, so that works out, if you do the math, to $17 as a charge to the consumer. In the far lower right-hand corner, this is what we call a package job, meaning I've got a dollar amount that I want to make sure this job comes up at, and whether I add on an oil filter that's $5 or $7 or $9, we want to make sure that it's still going to be at that $32.99 price point. So even though it says the labor charge would be $17 based upon the calculated math, in this case, the package price is going to carry the day in terms of where our pricing ends up for this particular piece. I'm going to click on OK. So it added on a labor line. It's my 5W30 full service oil change. I could change that description if I saw fit. But right now, $0 in parts, so there is $32.99 in labor for a $32.99 package total. I'd like to add the parts that we're going to use as part of this service as well. So in this case, we're going to need an oil filter, and we're going to also need oil as we're performing this oil change on this vehicle. So if I was to go up and I'm going to left click on the job itself, it highlights that line. And then when I click on parts in the upper left-hand corner, it's going to allow me to add a part onto a ticket. That left click to highlight trick, if you will, what that did in the miscellaneous piece is it says, well, I know whatever part we're adding is now going to get assigned to that oil change job. We just have one job on a ticket, not necessarily as relevant, but if I had, let's say, 5 or 10 different jobs on a ticket, each time I add a part, I want to make sure that it gets tied to a specific or particular job. So in this case, we're going to add on our parts. Now we need a 21040 oil filter and then 5W30 oil. As we go through our scenarios, I'm playing it out as if we already know what those elements are. Again, our purpose today isn't to spend time looking through our catalog integrations, finding those parts, finding that capacity, or that viscosity, but we're going to just add the parts onto a ticket. So I said the first one was a 21040. And as I put that in, anytime I'm typing in a part number that exists in my local inventory, we're looking for something that should be on our shelf, we're going to either hit the Enter key on the keyboard, or over to the right, there's a button there that says Search INV, in this case, the abbreviation INV for inventory. And it says, well, I've got a few different matches based upon what you put in there, either a tractor muffler, an oil seal, and or in our case, we're looking for that 21040 oil filter. I have 2 of them on my shelf, and they retail for $5.99. So I'll grab that line and then click on OK. I could also hit the Enter key on the keyboard. and it says, well, this is based upon that part existing in my inventory, what I know about it. It's a 21040, the line code of SFI. We're by default putting 1 into this vehicle, $1.48 my cost, and then $5.99 the selling price to the consumer. Now this was part 1 of 2. What I mean by that is we need to add we're adding the oil filter. I also need to add the oil. If I click on OK, it's going to take me out of this window and back over to our parts and labor tab. In this case, we've got one more part I'd like to add. I'm going to hit next in the lower right hand corner. And then it adds that part onto the ticket and leads me into my editing part window. Essentially, I saved myself one click. If I clicked on OK to leave, I'd have to click the part icon in the upper left hand corner to come back. My part number for my 5W30 oil starts with a dot and then the word oil, and then in my listing, there's my 5W30 oil. In this case, I want 5 of them. So after I've selected the appropriate part, I'm going to make 5 my quantity. And in the lower right-hand corner, seeing as that's the last part we need to add, I'll click on OK. So now what you'll notice, we're back over our transaction where it says, well, in my case, we're maintaining the integrity of the price of the part. So it's $16.44 in parts, $16.55 in labor to make up our $32.99 oil change for this particular vehicle. So just a basic example, adding an existing labor job that's a package along with some parts. Let's go through another scenario. If I went into my labor icon, and this time we're going to do some brake work. So I'm going to go down to brakes, and we're just going to install a new set of front brake pads on this vehicle. So I selected, in this case, install front disc brake pads is my description. If I wanted to add additional text to that, I would just put in that window there. You'll notice in this case, 1 hour is my build time, $85 is my rate, so $85 the charge to the consumer. Again, that's what I have pre-configured for this job. This is not a package price, meaning we're going to charge at this point 1 hour's worth of labor, and then whatever the brake pads would cost will go on top in order to determine what the job would be for the consumer. I'll click on OK, and we add that line onto the ticket to install the front disc brake pads. Let's add the brake pads onto this transaction as well. So I'll click Part in the upper left-hand corner. Now again, you'll notice I didn't highlight the job. So down here where it says job, I'm going to have to make sure that I reassociate this part with my install brake pad job. But as I'm going through, if I know the part number, I could search by part number. I could also search by the description. So if I just put in brake pad as a description, now it's searching through my entire inventory to find out, well, find me anything that begins or that contains the words brake pad. In our case, a handful that have that as their descriptor. If I find one or the appropriate one we want to add onto this transaction, I could then click on OK. It'll fill in my quantity, my cost, and my price. Let's tie that to our appropriate job and then hit OK, lower right-hand corner. So now, as opposed to maintaining the integrity of a package, it counts dynamically by adding these two together to come up to $154.99. If I needed to change either of those values, if I double-clicked on the brake pad, well, here's my price per unit. If that's going to be $79.99, then I go ahead and I just type that value there. If I wanted to change the labor that we're charging to the lower right-hand corner, if I said, well, we're going to make that 1.2 hours, then it's going to redo the math. And or I could leave it at 1 hour and change the charge. And if I said, well, we're going to make that $100 in labor, again, you can define whether the math here works forwards, backwards, or not at all. Meaning, I don't want to necessarily give my tech extra credit, but I do want to charge the consumer more than and or a different value than what was previously or originally associated. So again, we make whatever changes we need to the parts and labor as we go through. And again, just an example of using parts and labor in this case, not a package job as we add it onto our transaction. A few more examples as we continue on. I'm going to go back up to the labor icon in the upper left-hand corner. I'm going to add on a labor job because we're going to do a trans flush, just our basic auto trans fluid exchange. It's a package price at $99.99. I don't have any default time for our technicians. When I click on OK, the difference or the nuance you'll see here is it's brought over both my job for the automatic transmission fluid exchange, and then I have that configured using what's called a parts kit to add on 8 quarts of auto trans fluid. So in this case, you'll notice even though the only thing we added was a labor line using a parts kit, we can have it automatically pre-associate. We know that when we do this job, we're going to use these parts. With the oil filter, typically, with the oil change, typically my 5W30 oil, we configure that with a parts kit so that it automatically came across with 5W30 oil. As we get into this afternoon's conversation about some of the configuration elements, we'll talk a little more about parts kits and adding them onto transactions. So as we're going through again, a way that we can add that on, so we've got our automatic transmission fluid exchange along with the trans fluid that's going to be necessary as part of that service. One last piece before we're done with this morning's conversation, and that is we don't always have to have elements built or pre-established inside of the system. For example, if I went up to labor, I said, well, you know what, I need to add in my steering and suspension category a job to charge a customer to remove and replace the power steering pressure switch. I will promise you, if you go up and down all the way through my list, nowhere is there a pre-established job to remove and replace the power steering pressure switch. So if I just needed to add a line onto a transaction, I could come in here and I could just say, we'll just abbreviate for time's sake. I'll just type in, well, here is the job that I want to charge my consumer for. So again, just because it's not pre-established in the list certainly doesn't mean we wouldn't perform the service. So I'm going to recommend you always select a category that's primarily for reporting purposes. So as we're trying to associate dollars with dollars, we want to keep like elements together, but we associate or select a category. And then I just typed in, here is the job that we're going to perform. Again, in that job description, you can be as extensive as you'd like. 4,000 characters is actually your limitation. But down to the lower right-hand corner, we're going to establish that that's going to be, we'll say, 3/4 of an hour. And it'll do the math for me to say $63.75 will be the fee for having remove and replace that power steering pressure switch. Now, I don't have those in my master inventory, meaning I'm going to have to buy that on the outside, nor do I intend to ever stock those. So therefore, there's no reason I have to put the part into my master inventory. When I go up to part, and if I said, well, let's see, the part number as I looked at my invoice that came from my vendor was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, if I wanted to, I could search my inventory. In this case, I know it's not going to be there. So if I did, it's going to tell me, well, there are no matches found. Quite honestly, if it's not something that's in my inventory and it's not something that I'm ever intending to stock, whether we search our inventory or not, somewhat irrelevant. I'm going to click on OK in this case to acknowledge the fact that I'm aware that it is not a part that's in my master inventory. Whether I had searched or not, like I said, in this case, a little bit or somewhat irrelevant. As we go through our description, it's going to be a power steering pressure switch. And again, pardon my typing skills for just a moment. So we'll put that in there. If there was a line code that came in on my paperwork from my vendor, we could enter that as well. We're only selling just a single. And out here where it says cost per unit, as I looked at it, it cost me $23.87. And because I'm using what we're calling our smart pricing or our smart matrix pricing, it's coming up and telling me that based upon my settings, that'd sell for $70.99. And oh, by the way, that works out to be a 66.38% margin. So it automatically does the math for me based upon my cost per unit. As we get down a little further, where we've got miscellaneous, if we're using department, we'll assign our department, our technician, and or if you're using reason for replacement. So all of those can be turned on or off at your discretion. The lower right-hand corner, we're going to go ahead and associate a supplier. We bought that from AC Delco. And then if I'm using accounts payable, or if I've got the invoice number box required, before I can finalize this transaction, we'll have to go ahead and enter in some more information about the vendor invoice, validate the price, and so on and so forth. But so again, I just wanted to add a part onto a ticket so I can give an estimate to a customer. I'll click on OK. So again, that remove and replace power steering pressure switch is telling us that, okay, this is the part that we're going to use. So again, I don't have to have pre-established labor jobs for everything. I don't have to have pre-established parts for every part I'm going to sell. Certainly that list would be well beyond what I'm willing to throw into my master inventory. So anytime I need to, I just use the part icon or the labor icon. Again, with the labor icon, I'd recommend you select a category before you type in your description. With the parts, just fill in whatever is defined by your required entry so we can go ahead and sell that to the consumer. A couple last pieces as we finish up our conversation here. You'll notice S versus N, and then up arrows in all of these cases. On the left-hand side, and again, slightly different Gen 1 versus Gen 2. What you'll notice is there is an S versus an N, indicating whether it's a stocking item or a non-stocking item. That arrow that points up or down is telling me whether or not the part currently as priced meets or exceeds our minimum margin. So I came back into the power steering pressure switch just to show an example. In this case, I went ahead and I changed the selling price to $30, which works out to only be a 20% margin, which then tells me that the profit margin has fallen below the minimum and asks if I'd like to adjust the price. For purposes of this morning's conversation, I'm going to say no. And what you'll notice is my arrow goes from pointing up to pointing down. So on the left-hand side of each part line, indicating to us whether it's in stock or out of stock, and whether it's at or above or below our minimum margin. Now, the same icons exist on Gen 1, a little bit of a different look and feel, meaning if you were looking at Gen 1, there's actually 4 different icons that could appear on that left-hand side. There's a spark plug, and a spark plug indicates that both the stocking status and the margin are both good. There is a hand that points down. That hand indicates that while it's a non-stock item, the margin is at or above the minimum. There is an arrow that points down, and that would indicate that it's an item we're getting out of stock, so it's in our inventory. However, it's below our minimum margin. And then last but not least, an X, which indicates to me that both my stocking status and my margin are poor, meaning it's out of stock as well as it's below my minimum margin.